I was so fascinated when I came across you, and I can't even remember how it was. I think you liked, maybe it was one of the Canadian Bitcoin Coalition posts or something. And I looked at it and I was like, death and Bitcoin, this sounds a bit dark. And then I looked at your profile and I was like, a death doula? What's a death doula?
Yeah, I get that a lot.
I was like, I have to talk to this person. This is way too interesting. But your bio is fascinating as well. I find this so incredible about Bitcoin that it's almost like any facet of life that you take, there's some kind of connection, no matter what you do in life, that takes you back to Bitcoin. So death is the first one time, like yours is the first time I've actually come across that. But I'm so curious to talk to you. It's yeah, I'm really, really interested in hearing what you do, I guess, and also how
Yeah,
all these things are linked. So I guess if we kick off first, would you mind just introducing yourself and telling people who you are?
sure. Um, I always find that it's such a big question, especially as you get older, right? Because you're like, okay, how far back do I go? So my name is Erin. I am Canadian. I was raised just outside of Toronto, moved out to Alberta and spent 9 years in Alberta. And then I've been on the coast of British Columbia for the last 6 years with lots of getaway time in between. So I spent a year down in the US, 2022, 2023. And then I came down to El Salvador in November of, I was going to say this year, but it's last year. And I spent 2 months in El Zonte, Bitcoin Beach. And now I am in Guatemala at Bitcoin Lake, which is Lake Atitlan for anyone who has not heard of that before. And what that means is it's another one of the Bitcoin circular economies that is really, really successful. There's over 60 businesses here that have started accepting Bitcoin just over the last 2 years. And in a couple of weeks, I'm off to Bitcoin Yucatan, which is another circular economy. I'm incredibly passionate about the grassroots community level Bitcoin adoption and actually seeing in real time how Bitcoin is changing people's lives, how it is changing society. So that was my mission this winter, was to not be in Canada and to come down to Latin American countries. I've spent a lot of time in South America and Central America, so it feels good to be back here and just see Bitcoin as this normal thing. I would say probably 90% of the transactions I've done over the last 2.5 months have all been in Bitcoin. I just used a bank machine yesterday for the very first time since getting down here.
Wow.
So, but I guess I'm getting a little off track. This is supposed to be about who I am, but so I'm a traveler, I suppose. Yeah, you could discern that from everything I just said. Um, I've worked in restaurants my entire life since I was 16 and dabbled in different careers along the way, always trying to kind of work my way out of restaurants. And then finally coming to the realization that working in restaurants has given me a really beautiful life, a very flexible
Mm.
life where 80% of my income has been under the table. So I think a lot of people that work in restaurants are Bitcoiners. They just don't know it yet. If they want to keep the government out of their income situation. So I've been a yoga teacher. I'm a certified holistic nutritionist, although a lot of my ideas around that have changed over the last couple of years. And most recently in 2021, during the pandemic, I became certified as a death doula and I became a Bitcoiner, I think 2 or 3 months after that. And
Oh, really? So the Bitcoining, wow, how long have you been a Bitcoiner then?
since September of 2021.
Oh, okay. So we're very similar class. I'd say I was probably early August 2021, I think it was. Yeah, so we're
Yeah,
virtually the same. Oh, isn't that fascinating? So can you explain what a death doula actually is?
sure. So most people are probably familiar with a birth doula. That's something that's made a huge resurgence over the last decade, maybe 2 decades. So a doula literally is a person of service. I think that's how the word is defined. So there's doulas actually in all kinds of different areas. I've seen menopause doulas, a person of support, basically, wherever you need it in your life. So a death doula, the interchangeable term is end of life doula. Some people are a little more comfortable with the end of life
Don't say the
phrase,
D
and
word.
don't say the D word, big scary things will happen. Yeah. So we support people at end of life, essentially. And the specifics of that are specifically through end of life planning. So we help people sit down and identify their values and the things that they want for their end of life. Maybe there's some unfinished business that they want to take care of, if they want to leave some sort of legacy behind for their family. And then kind of the more practical stuff, like where do they want to die? How do they want that to look? How do they want that to feel? What would they like to have happen to their body afterwards? And we companion people through the actual physical process of dying. And
What does
I
that
think,
mean? Sorry, you mean sit with them as they're dying?
yeah. So again, a death doula, we are not medical professionals, so we don't offer medical intervention or any kind of physical caregiving, but
Mm.
we are there as a, I don't know if the word impartial is right, but we are there. The way I love to think about it, the best is as a compassionate rock. So we are just kind of this neutral support person who is available for the person dying, and at the same time for the people surrounding that dying person, friends, family. A lot of the work that we do actually is in supporting people who find themselves in a caregiving role. Because often, because we're not having these conversations about death and end of life and what that all looks like, many people find themselves in a caregiver role and they feel completely underprepared and scared about what to do, what it's going to look like, how the whole process is going to go. So I would say we support the dying person and their people equally. And then there's some after death stuff, like some death doulas are grief counselors, or I don't want to say grief experts because I don't know. I mean, I think all humans are grief experts in a way. But there's a lot of that as well, because grief is kind of the primary emotion that surrounds death. So,
Yeah. How do you train for that then? Like, how long is the process and where do you go to train?
well, that's an interesting question as well, because really all humans are death doulas. We all have the capacity to be with life, period. We all have the capability to be with transitions. We all have the ability to listen and to be that compassionate, open-hearted person for people. But we've lost touch with all of that. And
Mm.
in an interesting way, I think money has a lot to do with why that's happened. But we used to die at home. Up until 100 years ago, we were dying at home, surrounded by friends and family. Friends and family would take care of the body after death, take care of the burial. It was Death was an at-home life experience, and it's just over the last 100 years that it's become this medicalized, outsourced event that happens. And I think because of that, a lot of what happens around death happens now behind closed doors. And the only death that we get exposed to is through media a lot of the time. And it's a lot of the times death is violent, scary. It's not presented in a peaceful, sacred way. So because it's unfamiliar and because we really the only time we see death is through media, we have a distorted um a distorted idea of what death is and how it looks. So What was your initial question? Now I'm off on a bit of a tangent.
Yeah, no, sorry, I was deep into your tangent as well.
Yeah.
I think the question was how you actually train for it, like what the training
Mm.
process is.
Okay, good, good, good. That was my point. Thank you. So, yeah, it's kind of interesting that a training even really exists. Like, in my opinion, we should know as humans how to do this. It should be familiar. Death should be a familiar process, but because of a number of different reasons, it's become very unfamiliar. So I think when you get trained, you're just kind of you're tapping into this ancient wisdom that we all have, but we've just never looked at it before. We've never accessed it before. So it's a bit of a Wild West sort of an industry. I personally took a program through Douglas College in Vancouver, and they offer online and in-person trainings all across Canada in end-of-life doula certification. It's been a couple years since I've taken the course, but it was only a week long. And I think, oh my gosh, this course could be a year, it could be 2 years. And when you zoom out, it's actually training to deal with life, death, and grief is like a lifelong training course, you know? So there are certification rules that exist and there are some regulations that are coming, but right now it's kind of unregulated. Like if you feel called to do this work and you do this certification course, you can be an end of life doula.
Huh. Wow. So could you walk through the steps of what that actually looks like then? So is it usually the person that's dying that contacts you, or is it their family? And then what happens at that point?
Yeah, so I became an end of life doula during the pandemic at a time when it was virtually impossible to go into people's homes. Although you might say that was the time when it was actually the most needed, but access was not easy to get. So my primary focus after I became certified was to work with people in creating end of life plans. So most people actually that contacted me weren't even at their end of life. They were kind of women at midlife who wanted to start thinking about, because I say that death work is life work. Like all the things that are going to matter to you at your end of life are actually what matter right now. If
Mm,
there's relationships that you want to heal, if there's a certain way that you want things to be at the end and they're not that way now, like what better time to start working on it than right now? Because we all know we're going to die, but nobody knows when and how that's going to happen. So most people that I've worked with up to this point have been people who are interested in creating end of life plans and using that work to inform their life. I'm in regular contact with other doulas who say it's about 50-50. 50% of the time, it's a person dying who wants support. And a lot of these people may not have children, or their spouse may have already passed. They don't have a strong support system of family and friends around them. So they want this
mm,
external support to come in. And then about 50% of the time, it's people who find themselves in a caregiving role because often the person dying, they want someone that they are familiar with. So they want a sibling or they want a child or even a parent to be that person for them. But then, like I said previously, most of us are just woefully underprepared to step into that role and we really don't know how to handle it. So doulas are there to support the caregivers as well.
mm. What kind of stuff do people need at end of life then? I mean, is it very practical things like this is how you care for somebody? Is it here's where you go to get your will done? These are the things that you should consider. Like this is how you contact a funeral home to make the preparations and like is it kind of these are the steps of grief that people are going to go through? Like, what kind of stuff do you have like a checklist almost that you go through?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing to mention as well that I haven't mentioned yet is that doulas, I mean, the interesting thing about death is that no one has died and then come back to tell everybody this is what we should do and this is how we should prepare for it and this is what's going to happen. I mean, we're all just
I don't know. I mean,
offering
there's
our
plenty of people with like near-death experiences who are
well,
like,
that is true. I think those are a little bit different, but I know what you're saying. But um, so doulas really have no specific agenda, and I think that's important for people to understand. Like, we're not going to show up and say, okay, you need to do this, 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 and this. We are really there. We show up and we say, how can I help? So every person that's going through the end of life experience is going to require support in a different way. Some people have no idea about the practical aspects of it. Some people have no idea that you need a certificate of death to give to the funeral home and all these practical things that involve a lot of money and a lot of red tape. And then there are people who are prepared in that way, but they're not prepared from a emotional or a spiritual standpoint. So, and it's obviously up to doulas as individuals. When we meet with a person and the person lets us know what it is that they need, we then have to be really honest with ourselves and with them. Am I going to be the person that's best suited for this person? And if the answer is no, who do I know in my doula network that I could refer this person to? I think that's really, really important. So, but ultimately, I think what people need the most at the end of life is someone who has a lot of compassion, a lot of empathy, but there's no history. So there's a lot of family dynamics. I think we all know. I think one of my favorite quotes, I forget who said it, but maybe it was the Buddha or Ram Dass, I'm not sure, but he said, if you think you're enlightened, go spend a week with your family, right? Because we have these family dynamics that play out over time. And it's like, no matter how old we get, how much therapy we go to, we still all kind of have these default roles that we play within the family unit. And in my experience, all of those dynamics become really amplified at end of life. You know, if someone is high anxiety or really avoidant or whatever else you want to put in there, when faced with death, and I'll just use the example of a parent because that's what's most typical, it's children caring for parents. A lot of that just gets amped up like times 10. So that can be difficult on everybody involved, not just the person passing. So I feel like doulas really help to come in as this neutral, like we're not on anybody's side. We're not trying to accomplish anything one way or the other. We just want to support the person at end of life and just be a calm, neutral person in the room that can just kind of bring the energy down if it needs to be brought down, or say some things that need to be said, or just relieve people of the pressure of having to be in that space. Like, we'll go walk the dog if that's what needs to be done, or we'll listen to people. I think that's a massive part of it, because everybody at end of life, whether you're the person dying or the person surrounding them, everyone's going through big emotions, big stuff, even if they aren't aware of what the emotions are and why they are having them. Everyone's going through stuff. So to have, again, like to have a neutral person present who can just listen and not take anything on, because it's not ours to take on. I'm not going to take offense to anything that you say or think, and I'm not going to have an opinion about it. So I think that that's probably what's most important for people.
Yeah. How do you tie that back then to money? Because you said you think the reason that our relationship with death has kind of been broken, and you sort of think that that's because the money is broken. Could you talk about that?
Yeah. So like I was saying, death used to happen at home. We used to live in small communities and we would take care of it. So death wasn't a big scary thing because we all witnessed it, or we used to back then. I say we like I was around back then. I wasn't, but what we know about human history. So in the 1940s, and particularly in Canada, because we have socialized healthcare, but after the Second World War, the Industrial Revolution started happening. People started leaving these small communities, moving to cities. So even though you're surrounded by more people in these big cities, your community has actually shrunk. You know, it kind of came down to the idea of the nuclear family, mom, dad, and siblings. And so everybody is working. Women started to enter the workplace as well. Um, so if somebody got sick in the family, there wasn't the number of people around that could help support. And if both parents are working, they don't have the capacity to take on a caregiving role for someone who needs it. So again, particularly in Canada, when universal healthcare was introduced, it's like, oh, okay, I don't have time to do this, so I'm gonna, I'll let the hospital or the nursing home, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't rely on hospitals and nursing homes, but that's part of what took death out of the home was both parents working. And if you understand the nature of fiat money and how it debases and is devalued over time, we need to work longer, harder in order to maintain the same standard of living. So I feel like this point in time in particular is really interesting because the baby boomers are entering elderhood, late elderhood. And yet everyone my age, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, even 60s are working more, working harder. The majority of us are because inflation is running so high. So I think we are coming to a point where we simply don't have the infrastructure in society to deal with the amount of caregiving that's going to need to happen. And we can see it coming. So that's why I think these conversations are so important. We can see it coming. So my goal or my mission is to help people be proactive. So knowing the truth of what's coming, what can we do about it, as opposed to being reactive, allowing hospitals to be overrun. Like I think it's going to come down to people having to choose, am I going to continue to work or am I going to stay at home full time and take care of my elderly parents? Because we can no longer afford a nursing home or a retirement community or whatever system is in place that people would traditionally rely on.
It's funny, actually, it does always strike me as interesting that, you know, like you say, parents go out and work and then they hire somebody to come and live in their house or visit their house and look after their children, and their parents get put in a nursing home. And I always think to myself, this feels very inefficient. It's amazing that it's kind of ended up that way. And I guess it's because people have to go to the office rather than working in fields or locally in their community. So you're forced to go into a place of work. And now the whole family structure of what it should be, these sort of multi-generational homes, is just completely broken. And it seems completely illogical. And I did think that one of the few positive things that maybe came out of COVID was this whole notion of working at home and normalizing that again, because it's actually a much more normal way for a married couple to coexist, for family to coexist, and for kids to be actually at home learning rather than being outsourced into an institution to go and do their learning there. I mean, it really kind of restored almost the family unit in a weird kind of way. And I know a lot of people were very stressed because their kids were at home and they were doing online learning and things like that. But it also meant that parents had much better supervision over what was happening at schools. I mean, I think one of the big backlashes about all of the stuff that's being taught in schools really only happened because parents suddenly saw what the teachers were teaching their kids and were like, oh my God. And I had a whole bunch of parents say to me as well, my God, we get all the work done in like 2 hours. What were they doing all day at school? And I think all of that, including the elder care, it would make so much more sense for the whole generation to all be in one household. I mean, and how lovely for, somebody in their 80s to have small children running around and that kind of youth in the house instead of being sat in a care home with other elderly people in various different states of decay. I just, yeah, it just feels to me like that's a much more healthy way of structuring family.
Yeah, I think so as well. And I do agree with your point that I think the pandemic helped a lot of people kind of wake up to what's going on. Like, do I need to spend 50 or 60 hours a week outside of my home? Can I work from home? Do I have the ability to homeschool my children? And I feel like those conversations happen a lot in the Bitcoin community. Birthing at home as opposed to birthing in the hospital. I mean, essentially, I kind of feel like death is the last piece of the puzzle. I've been to a number of Bitcoin conferences where we do talk about homeschooling, where we do talk about home birth, but no one's quite talking about death yet. And I think that that might be the last thing to come in. And I think that Bitcoiners are uniquely positioned to have this conversation because we understand the idea of scarcity. We understand that the more scarce something is, the more valuable it is. And the only thing more scarce than Bitcoin is your time, your life, right? So I think and we also have a really interesting relationship with truth also. So I just think those two things, we recognize scarcity as a beautiful thing, something that creates more value. And we also really honor and respect that which is true. And I don't think you can deny that death is a universal truth and that our time is the most scarce and valuable asset that we have. I just think we haven't been having that conversation, at least maybe not in public up to this point. So I hope that's kind of why I'm here. Like I hope to be the person that encourages people to talk about it. And I'm not saying I have all the answers, but I'm just showing up as a person who is not afraid of the conversation. I actually feel that the conversation's really beautiful and it actually helps you to appreciate your life even more. I think there's a misconception that if we talk about death, it means that we're negative or we're depressed, or by saying the word, it's like Beetlejuice, like we're inviting it to happen if we say the word death 3 times, but I just think that's just because we don't do it enough. We haven't normalized it yet. And just like we're all kind of working towards normalizing Bitcoin, especially in these circular economies, I see these signs everywhere, like Bitcoin accepted here. And that just helps normalize it for people. They don't really have to question, what is this thing? Where did it come from? Why would I want to use it? It's just like a Visa or a MasterCard sign. And I think we can do the same thing with death. It's just a part of life. Just birth, you come in, and death, you go out. And there's a lot of mystery between where we came from and where we're going. And there's a lot of mystery, I think, too, in life. Like, no one really even knows why we're here in the first place. But I think we miss out on
Nobody talks about that. I often say that to people. I'm like, we're on
yeah,
a rock hurtling through space and we have no idea why we're here. And it's just amazing how people go through their lives and just don't even question that. It's like, what's the point?
yeah, yeah. And I like to think about that. We get so caught up in things that seem really mundane and we really let it impact us and stress us out. But then, just like you said, it's like if you zoom out for a minute and you go, okay, I don't even know what this whole thing is about. We're on a rock hurtling through space. Nobody knows where we came from, where we're going, why we're here. I just feel like it helps to put a lot of things into perspective.
Do you have any thoughts, given that you've sort of spent time with people who are at end of life? Do you have any thoughts about where you go afterwards? Like, what are your personal beliefs about the afterlife?
I have no idea. I think anything is possible. I think anything is possible. I just have no idea. It could be something completely insane that we haven't even thought of, or we haven't even conceptualized. I think there is one universal consciousness. And if you want to call that thing God or source or love or whatever, I think those are just all different words for the same thing. So I do think that all humans are different incarnations or different representations of that one universal consciousness. So I think that when we die, I think that whatever our consciousness is, I wouldn't even know how to start to describe that, but I think we go back to that. And whatever we do here on the planet helps to contribute towards the universal consciousness and in my opinion, the evolution of humanity as a species. But beyond that, I don't know. I mean, we definitely are energetic beings. Energy is all things. So our energy goes somewhere. Whether or not, I don't know. Sometimes I think I believe in reincarnation, and then sometimes I don't. And sometimes I think maybe we die and the lights just go out and that's it. It's impossible to know. But I think whatever people believe that brings them comfort and brings them a sense of meaning, great.
And how do you tie the whole Bitcoin? I guess actually to take a step back, what got you into Bitcoin? Because you were already trained as a death doula by then, right? So then, like, what happened that got you interested in Bitcoin, and then how did that tie back into the death piece?
Mm-hmm. I was living in Canada, and September of 21 was when, I mean, we'd already been going through COVID for a year and a half. And September of 21 was when the government announced the vaccine passports and all of these vaccine mandates, and people were losing their jobs. And I was just fed up. I was fed up with all of it. And I think as well, because I had just been trained as a death doula, I had a real tangible connection to how short our lives are, how finite the amount of time we have here. And I just saw all around me how much life people were willing to give up in order to avoid death, when death is a guarantee anyway. So
Mm.
how much of our finite time are we willing to exchange for this illusion of avoiding death? I mean, to me, I understand why people do that, but I think it's all rooted in this fear of death. I feel like the fear of death was really weaponized against the public at that time. And the stories I hear of people who, like the countless stories of people who had loved ones who passed away in hospitals or in long-term care homes that could not have a family member with them. Like I have goosebumps all over my body. Like, I feel like that was just the most egregious crime against humanity that could have been committed. So anyway, all that to say, I was just really fed up with the government at that point. So I was dating someone at the time, and I was voicing all of this to him, and he kind of looked at me sideways, and he hadn't mentioned Bitcoin before. We'd only been dating for a couple of weeks, but he looked at me and he said, "Have you ever heard of Bitcoin by any chance?" And I had, because I had been listening to Joe Rogan for a long time, and he had Andreas Antonopoulos on back in the day, 2015 or 2016, I think it was. And at the time, when I listened to Andreas, I remember thinking, oh, like, yeah, this Bitcoin thing, sound money, that makes a lot of sense. But it was 2016. I had no idea how to get Bitcoin. I didn't even really know what it was. I thought it was a stock or an investment. And so that just kind of, the seed was planted in my consciousness, but it just kind of died at that point. But when this guy I was dating asked me if I had it, the way he positioned it, because he knew how I felt about the government. So the way he positioned it was that Bitcoin is this currency that exists outside of any kind of government control, and that it's a great way to just exit the whole system in a sense, to whatever degree that you want to do that, whether you're just wanting to preserve wealth or you want to 100% just exit that entire game of fiat money. So when he said that, I think within 2 weeks, I had a hardware wallet and I was buying Bitcoin and putting it in cold storage. And I had quit my job at that time. So I had nothing else to do but read books, listen to Bitcoin podcasts, watch things on YouTube. Like it just, and I've always been a Bitcoiner. That's why when I say like, oh yeah, since September of 2021, and that just doesn't seem long enough, because I really feel like my whole life I've had a revolutionary sort of a spirit. Like I remember watching documentaries about the Vietnam War protests and just feeling in my soul like, yeah, this is the right thing, like power to the people. I've always been really passionate about that. So discovering Bitcoin was like, this is why I'm here.
Wow. It's amazing, actually, how many people came to Bitcoin during the pandemic. I talk to people all the time who are like, yeah, 2020, I basically was looking around me at what was happening and was like, this is crazy. And then I started reading and discovered Bitcoin. I mean, it's literally like a sea of people who've come over onto the Bitcoin camp in that period of time. Um, so, how do you think that Bitcoin might fix some of this relationship that we have with death, or kind of improve the relationship that we have with death? Where do you see that fitting in?
Yeah. So initially, because I feel like I became a death doula and a Bitcoiner at the same time, virtually the same time. And initially I thought, okay, I need to keep these two things completely separate. I can never let my end of life clients know that I'm a Bitcoiner. They'll think I'm a total weirdo, and vice versa, right? And then the more time I spent in both worlds, like probably 50% of my time, I was focused on end of life planning, that whole thing. And then the other 50% of the time I was thinking about Bitcoin. And the more time I spent in both, I mean, I really feel like the big benefit of Bitcoin is that it's a very empowering technology. So it empowers me to preserve my wealth. And the way that we obtain wealth is, again, by exchanging our time, exchanging our energy for this physical representation of our energy, which is money. So it allows me to be in charge of that and not have to trust anyone else or think for whatever reason that I'm not capable of doing that for myself. So the empowering aspect of Bitcoin, and I see that there's also a very empowering aspect to death. I I think if we can become more sovereign and more empowered in the experience of life and the end of life transition, it's going to make the entire experience better. Like I think that both of those things, recognizing that death is a truth and that we can be okay with it, even though there's still a lot of mystery, there's still a lot of unknowns, there is a lot of grief, there is a lot of sadness, but we can handle it. We can handle it. We have what it takes. We are capable individuals. And I feel like the way society's been structured over the last 100 years, it's been a very disempowering experience. We outsource a lot of our personal responsibility to other people. We outsource it to financial planners, to bankers, and we outsource it to medical professionals, nurses, long-term care homes. And I think it's this whole idea of reclaiming the entire experience of what it means to be a human, like pulling our energy back in, looking at the truth of the situation and realizing, like, not only am I capable of doing this, not only am I capable of managing my own money, holding my wealth, not only am I capable of companioning people at end of life and going through end of life myself, like we were born to do this. We were born as, in my opinion, sovereign, autonomous, empowered individuals. But again, over the years, we become disempowered. And whether you want to blame it on the money, I don't know. I kind of do, but for people that might not know about money and how it works, I think the modern education system, going to work, there's this whole idea of this lack of self-worth. Like, I'm not capable. I don't have what it takes. I need other
Yeah.
people to help me manage my life, and we do need other people. We need other people for support, for community. But to me, those death and Bitcoin have just been two incredibly empowering tools in my life, and real tools, like real things that you can look at, not just reading a self-help book and going, oh yeah, okay, those ideas make a lot of sense, but then you don't actually get to experience it in real life. And I feel like death and Bitcoin actually help you to experience it so that it becomes real and not just conceptual.
It's interesting that contrast that you draw because I've observed that in Canada. Like I spent time living in Toronto and then live in Alberta now, and there is a distinct cultural difference between those two provinces. And when I think about the culture in Toronto, it's a very Zoomer culture. It's very dependent. It's like I go to the supermarket, I get my food, I come and sit in my little apartment, I work on my computer, I maybe go to my gym class or my yoga class. And in Alberta, I think the conditions are so extreme. Um, but there's a self-sufficiency here that is really lacking, certainly in the UK because the climate's mild and most people live in a city, but was also lacking in Canada, in Toronto. And I think because I've kind of seen those two cultures side by side in a very short space of time, it's really interesting seeing the difference. Like I feel like with many Albertans, they understand exactly how energy is produced, which is why they're so supportive of oil and gas, because they get how your home has to be heated. You're going to die if your home is not heated. And in order for your home to be heated, it's no good just sticking a wind farm up. You need actual reliable energy that's not intermittent in order to do that. They understand very well how their food ends up on their table. Many people are farmers, cowboys. They know how to produce actual food. And it does something to people psychologically, where I notice that there is a culture here that is much less dependent on government. It's much more autonomous, much more self-sufficient, but also much more pragmatic. Like there's a real can-do spirit that you just don't get, for example, in some of the Eastern, maybe not the coastal sort of the Atlantic provinces, because some of them are quite isolated and probably quite self-sufficient. But certainly, I'd say in Ontario, you don't see that as much. And I always puzzled about that as well, because I lived in the US for a long time, and there's a really interesting contrast between the US and the British culture. Like the British tend to be quite negative about things. It's like everything's always about how you can't do something. Like if you're an entrepreneur and you're like, I have this idea for a business, I'm being very stereotypical here, but it's true. The British will be like, oh, no, that can't be done. So it's too difficult. Yeah, somebody else tried. That's never going to work. You can tell an American the exact same thing, and they'll be like, oh my God, that's such a great idea. You could do this, you could do that. Yeah, that's amazing. And there's a real different attitude to these things. And I wonder whether it's because the vast majority of the Americans that are, living in that country right now are either pioneers themselves or descendants of very recent pioneers who've come in and had to kind of build something from scratch and face adversity and really deal with like the reality of how you get your food, how you power your energy, all this kind of stuff. And I wonder whether there's something in that. So what you're talking about then of this cycle of then building that self-sovereignty, it actually does something to you in terms of your ability to deal with reality, because you're not in this kind of very cocooned world where somebody's doing everything for you, but also maybe greater empathy and understanding, because you really kind of understand how things actually happen, and not the kind of tale that's woven about how these things come into existence. I don't know whether that's maybe a good analogy.
I think so, yeah. And what came to mind for me was the connection that we have to nature. So in Alberta, we have Edmonton, we have Calgary. They're two, metropolitan centers, not maybe compared to the Toronto area, but they're cities in their own right. However, they are surrounded by mountains and farms and all kinds of things. So whereas my brother's wife, for example, she grew up in Toronto. My brother and I grew up in a really small town on a farm. And it wasn't until she met my brother in her 20s that she went to a farm for the very first time. So I do think there's absolutely something to be said for these really, and for some reason, it kind of seems to happen on the East Coast. Like everyone came from Europe and the East Coast was the first place they landed, and
Yeah.
people established businesses and families there. And then slowly, some people started migrating out west. But the point of that is I feel that people in heavy metropolitan areas like Toronto, for instance, they just don't have that connection to nature. And when you're disconnected from nature, you really are disconnected from the life cycle. There's something to be said for people who grow up on farms, and you see when the barn cat dies, or that once a year you butcher the cow for dinner. Like death is just more, it's just there, it's just around more. Or you see a dead mouse in the basement. Little tiny things like that even that make you go, okay, yeah, death is part of life. It's all around us. And even if you've always lived in Calgary and chances are you've driven through the countryside, there's just more of a connection, I think, with nature. So
Yeah.
one of the first things I suggest to people, if they're super uncomfortable with death, it's like, just observe nature. Observe, especially in Canada and the US, like the changes of the seasons, changing from summer to fall, and the leaves die and they fall off the tree. And then we go into winter where everything is just dead in a certain aspect, right? But then the rebirth in the spring and everything blooms. It's like there really are examples all around us of how life actually works and how the life cycle goes. And again, I think just people that live in cities are just very disconnected from that. Even though they experience winter, it's a different pace of life. And maybe there's just not the same level of observation or awareness that people who live in more rural areas have.
Yeah, because winter is probably just, oh, I spend more time indoors watching Netflix and not, oh, I'm outside in the cold shoveling snow. I think
Mm.
that's probably it. A lot of the I was just thinking when you were saying that, because I've lived in cities for most of my life, and the other day like a bird flew into the window and it was like this almighty thud. And I was like, oh my God, what's that? So I go running outside, and this poor thing was like face down in the snow. So I go and pick him up with a tea towel, and I was like, oh, his beak's all bloody. So I wiped it off, and I'm holding him in my hands. And he just looks at me and he closes his eyes and just passed away. And I was like in floods of tears. I was like, oh my God, And I'm just not used to seeing that. Like during the pandemic, we went to upstate New York and we lived there for like 3.5 months because we were like, we don't need to stay in the city. We'll just go outside. And oh my God, like the road kit, like I ran over a marmot once, and you're going to think I'm such an idiot here, but I thought it was a beaver because I'd never seen a real beaver and I didn't realize that they're like dog size. So this thing, I ran over it on the road, and I had a truck behind me, so I couldn't stop. But all I saw was I was trying to avoid him and I sort of slowed down, but he ran and ended up under the tire. And then all I saw in the mirror was like this little tail flapping and the squashed, thing. And I was like, floods of tears again. Another day I was driving back because our dog was in a daycare, like a day camp nearby, and it was like a 45-minute drive. So you'd get like an hour and a half basically every day of like driving through, well, actually more than that because it's there and back each way. And I was driving back from dropping him off, and there's this deer lying in the road, and he's like still flapping his legs and stuff. So I pull over, I go over, I see he's still alive. So I go running down to this house, knocking on the door. I now realize that was a very bad idea because I was told that apparently this was in Pennsylvania. We were right on the border. And I was told that apparently like some people don't take kindly to strangers and they'll come out and point a gun at you. Anyway, so I'm like what do I do? How do I save this deer's life? Anyway, I ran back up the road, or back up the driveway to the road where I've parked the car. And then this guy's coming by in a truck. He pulls over and he said, "Oh, did you just hit it?" And I said, "No, I didn't, but it's there and it's alive." And he walked over and he looked and he went, "It's dead now." And he just grabs it by the legs, drags it to the side of the road. Like, I'm already like tears coming down my face like this. And all of its friends were standing on the side of the road, like just looking like really worried and stressed. And I was like, oh my God. And he's like, "Yeah, don't worry, it's dead." And I was like, "You just going to leave it there?" And he went, "Yeah, it's fine. Like the other animals will come and eat it or whatever." And I was just like, and I got back home and I was like, oh my God. And you just realize you're not used to seeing this stuff because, you go to the supermarket, you buy your meat and it comes in a plastic packet. And I was like, this thing died and its friends saw it and now they're going to be suffering trauma. And I was like, these people must think I'm pathetic. Like, this guy in his pickup must have just been like, ah, another COVID townie.
That's quite possible. Yeah. I mean, yeah, that's the reality.
Yeah.
Nobody gets out of here alive. And not that death is not sad and not that it can't be traumatic, but at the same time, that's how it goes. Like, that's the law of nature. That is creation and destruction. It's they are
Mm,
both. You can't have one and not have the other. And just like grief, you can't love without having grief, because at some point the thing that you love is no longer going to be there. So it's almost like exposure therapy. Like, I'm thinking, yeah, like you should probably look at more dead stuff, or I don't know. But again,
yeah.
that's just my idea. But yeah, I think there's a lot of I think because we just don't see a lot of death, we don't talk about death, that when we do see it, it is incredibly startling. Like, it really does shake us. And
Mm,
I would, I guess, my encouragement there, when I find myself really powerfully evoked emotionally by something,
mm,
for me, that's information. Like, okay, there's probably something in there that maybe I need to spend a little more time with, or maybe I need to look at a little bit more. That kind of emotional response is like, there's something living in there that maybe needs to come out a little bit more often, however
yeah.
that needs to happen.
So, in terms of like, I mean, it's really interesting because you've obviously tied this into Bitcoin and everything else, but like, what advice would you have for people then, aside of obviously going into nature and exposing themselves, but when they think about their life, is there a process that you would recommend in terms of looking at your life and then thinking about it in the context of your death and what you might do differently or what you might change? Um, when you actually contemplate your demise and then think about how you're living right now.
Yeah, I think what matters at the end is what matters right now. So if you were to die today, or if you were to get a terminal diagnosis and you had 1 week left to live, what are the things that you would want to still accomplish? And why aren't you doing that now? We all think that we have 80, 85, 90, 100 years to live this life, and most of us do. I mean, that is the way that things go, but the truth is that none of us know how much time is left. We could get hit with an asteroid this afternoon and this will all be over. So there's a good book that most people have heard of called The Top 5 Regrets of the Dying.
Oh no, I've
So
not heard of that. Hmm.
yeah. So, think if you look at that book, and I think this regret number 2 is, I wish I would have worked less. So I mean, that's where Bitcoin comes in. Hopefully we have this sound monetary asset that is going to allow us to actually work less and spend more time with our family and doing the things that we love. So yeah, just think about, if today was the last day of your life, who would you be calling? What would you be doing? What kind of legacy would you want to leave? And then really, what is preventing you from starting to take care of those things today.
And how do you temper that with a low time preference, though? Because obviously you need to work to, say, save up a nest egg to go traveling or whatever. So there's an element of putting in work now so that you can do something later. So how do you kind of balance those things?
Yeah, I think it's possible to do both. In this instance, in Bitcoin, we talk about high time preference versus low time preference. But I believe that when it comes to death, I think that a low time preference complements a high time preference and vice versa. So we can plan for the future. We can look to the future. We can look to our end of life and ask ourselves, who do I want there at my end of life? What does our relationship look like at the end? Where am I? What are the things that are around me? Like really doing a deep visualization about how it looks, how it feels, and holding that vision and having that vision. And then, so taking that low time preference vision and then bringing it into the present in a more high time preference way. What can I do now to start building on that, to start creating that? It might be something that you can change in a single phone call, or it might be something that takes you 5, 10, 15, 20 years to accomplish. Either way, whatever it is that you start doing now will lend itself to not just a better present moment, but it will bring you closer to your ideal version of what your end of life is going to look like.
Wow, deep stuff. This has been amazing. Thank you so much, Erin. This is so fascinating. I feel like I've got an insight into this, like very unusual and very little, as you say, talked about world, and what it, you know, and I guess also like life lessons of, like you say, how to live your life better in planning for what you might regret when you die. So are there any final thoughts that you want to leave people with? And could you also direct people to like your podcast, to the links and all your social media and all of that kind of stuff that where they can find you?
Mm-hmm. My podcast is called Decentralizing Death, where I have conversations with Bitcoiners and people that work in the end of life space. And sometimes those people are one and the same. I get lucky sometimes and talk to Bitcoiners who work in end of life. And what I'm exploring is this subject of how do we rely less on these centralized systems, which as Bitcoiners, we know are quite fragile. They're very big and they've been around for a really long time, but because they're so centralized, they are very fragile and they exist at the whim of our government and this printed money that they just can't stop, that they can't shut off. So how are we going to create a grassroots community-led and community-supported movement so that people can have more sacred and more beautiful end-of-life transitions, whether it's us as Bitcoiners that are going through the end-of-life process or us as Bitcoiners who are supporting people going through that process. So Decentralizing Death is the podcast, and then I'm on Instagram and X at Death and Bitcoin. And I'm available to be an end-of-life doula for all Bitcoiners as well.
Of course, I wouldn't expect anything less. Okay, and how should people contact you then? Is the best way to contact you through your social media channels? Like, do they DM you or do you have an email address? What's the best method?
Yeah, social media is probably best, but I also have an email, Erin, ERIN, at decentralizingdeath.com.
Okay, perfect. That's great. Well, thank you so much. This has been left me with a lot of food for thought and probably some planning. So thank you.
Thanks for having me.